The origin story of Disneyland is largely the story of one man, Walt Disney, who expanded studio entertainment from films to a theme park. But the story of Walt Disney World is the story of many people. If you look back through the offerings on Bandcamp, you'll find the story of Bob Foster, the man who oversaw the purchase of the Disney acreage in Florida. You'll also find the story of General Joe Potter, the man who oversaw the land development on property as Disney moved toward construction. You'll even find the story of the unbuilt beachside hotel that Disney wanted to create on the Florida coast, with the land purchased way back in 1971. But one of these stories, in fact the story that's most central to the opening of Disney World, is the story of Dick Nunes. During Walt's lifetime, in terms of company dynamics, Disneyland was controlled by two large interests: the men and women who operated and maintained the rides in Anaheim, and the men and women who designed and built the rides in Glendale, with the designers having more influence than the operations team. Dick Nunes, who joined Disneyland Incorporated just as the park was about to open in 1955, quickly rose through the ranks from a college graduate working in training to a man writing operation procedures for many rides, to the supervisor for Frontierland and Adventureland, to finally the person overseeing operations for the entire park, a position he began when he was only 29 years old. One of his goals early on was to increase the influence that the operations team had over park design, making operations, and therefore his division, on a type of equal footing with the Imagineers. In the late 1960s, as Walt's presence was beginning to fade, Nunes' influence began to grow. At Disneyland, Nunes developed his own growth philosophy centered around guest satisfaction that challenged many traditions at WED. During Walt's lifetime, WED designers had looked to art or film for inspiration, seeing themselves as the creators of fantasy. In this approach, WED designers produced experiences independent of guest input, looking to Walt as a visionary who understood the public better than the public understood itself. In contrast, Dick Nunes saw guests' self-knowledge as the key to successful growth. Quote, "The secret," he told one reporter, "is looking to see what guests like and giving it to them." This was one of the feedback loops that Nunes wanted to introduce into Disney design culture. During the 1950s and most of the 1960s, Nunes had deferred to Walt as he saw in him someone whose abilities far exceeded his own. But in the years following Walt's death, Nunes grew bolder with his ideas. He was at times confrontational, insisting that operations occupy a larger space in the planning meetings. Quote, "Do you know why I was politically correct for 11 years? Nunes said, "Because Walt was the boss. When he died, I decided I was not going to be politically correct again in my life. I was going to do what I thought Walt would want done." The redistribution of power from WED to operations was deeply resented by the designers. One key WED manager, Marty Sklar, would later explain, quote, "After Walt's death, Dick Nunes seemed to sense that there was a void to be filled, and he aggressively championed his own move up the Disney ladder." He even went so far as to say that Nunes' strategy to gain power was similar to that found in a business book called Winning Through Intimidation. From Sklar's vantage point, it felt like, quote, "a takeover of Imagineers." Nunes' goal was to make WED subservient to the operators, thereby controlling planning, design, and the selection of new attractions for the parks. Walt, who had once been central to balancing power inside the Disney company, was now gone, and his brother, Roy, more accustomed to financial decisions than creative ones, allowed WED to organize its own design hierarchy. As designer Bill Martin recalled, quote, "We suffered from it, I tell you. Roy stayed out of the design look of the place, but he was very interested in what we were doing. He stood aside." The story of the opening of Disney World is one of invention, imagination, and grit. But it's also the story of how the culture of the Disney company changed after Walt's passing. The story of how Dick Nunes, the head of park operations, challenged Dick Irvine, the head of the WED design team, for a larger space at the planning table. In the early phase of the Florida project, Dick Nunes' responsibilities were largely tied to Disneyland, where he supervised daily operations. Other members of the Florida executive team had more experience with project development and with construction. Particularly, Admiral Joe Fowler once managed a shipyard for the Navy, and General Joe Potter, retired from the Army Corps of Engineers, had built canals. The first time that Dick Nunes explored the Florida site, he found the scope of the Disney venture overwhelming. Quote, "I went out in a Jeep with a surveyor," Nunes once explained. "The surveyor said, 'Here we are.' I looked around at all that swamp. It just scared the hell out of me." As construction began in Florida, Nunes, as the director of operations at Disneyland, made monthly or bi-monthly trips to Florida. But the majority of his attention was still focused on California, making sure that the Anaheim park continued with the standards set by Walt. WED designer Rolly Crump recalls that during this time, quote, "Dick was a big, powerful guy who was really tough." Nunes made sure that cast members adhered to show standards, presenting the park with a unified vision focused on traditions and cleanliness. Once, while walking through a Disneyland restaurant, he noticed that a waitress had her hair arranged outside of park guidelines. "I just want to mention to you," he said, "that that's not according to code here at Disneyland." The person accompanying Nunes noticed that he issued the statement with a note of finality in such a way that all around knew that show standards were to be taken seriously under his watch. Another time, while Rolly Crump and Dick Nunes walked through the park, they noticed a guest spill popcorn in front of the castle forecourt, scattering kernels across the ground. "Now, Rolly, look at your watch," Nunes said. "Within less than 5 minutes, that popcorn will be gone." According to Crump, the popcorn was swept up by a cast member 3 minutes later. Quote, "That showed you how he ruled," Crump later explained. But as development continued on the Florida resort, Nunes began to insist that he, as the chief operations manager, have more input on how attractions and various themed areas were developed for the park. He wanted a hand in the creation of the Pirates of the Caribbean as well as the Haunted Mansion. At WED, where most everyone held a degree in either art, architecture, or engineering, Nunes' input was initially seen as an unwanted intrusion. Quote, "Dick's assault on the WED Imagineers began soon after Walt's passing," Marty Sklar said. "One of his principal targets was Richard Irvine, WED's design chief." At first, Nunes directed his suggestions at WED designers. Rolly Crump, who designed elements of Fantasyland for Florida, recalled that Nunes asked him to revise designs in light of operation needs. One such suggestion was that Disney World would have a pair of Mr. Toad rides to help manage crowds instead of the single ride with its long line at Disneyland. "What do you mean by that?" Crump asked. Opening his hands for emphasis, Nunes explained, "I want you to make 2 Mr. Toad rides, side by side exactly the same." Crump politely told him that he would think about it for a while, but in truth he thought it was, quote, "a dumb idea." That night, Crump went home and tried to come up with something better. Quote, "What I came up with," he later explained, "were 2 completely different rides in the same building. Each side would have its own little adventure and then come back together at the end of the ride." The changes increased the ride's throughput, the number of guests the attraction could handle each hour. But with discussions repeatedly focused on maximum efficiency rather than on art and design, the WED team soon gave Nunes a nickname. They called him Hop-Along Capacity. Another WED designer, Mark Davis, recalled that they also referred to Nunes as, quote, "the Stormtrooper," for the way he forcefully walked down hallways with firm footfalls and military starch in his shoulders. Nunes undeterred, started to look above individual designers to the head of Walt itself, Dick Irvine, to discuss his proposed changes. Irvine, who under Walt was used to having free rein over design, didn't appreciate Nunes' input. One confrontation, illustrating the tension between these two men, occurred in the office of Joe Fowler during a planning meeting. Quote, Nunes provoked Irvine until the design chief stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind him. After several seconds, however, the door opened again and Dick Irvine emerged, still furious, but now embarrassed, from Fowler's closet. By 1968, Nunes was making regular trips to Florida, trying to get his mind around how the Disney team was going to turn the property into a resort. Quote, it was a major challenge, Nunes would later explain. What people don't realize is that we were down there, frankly, in the middle of nowhere. You couldn't snap your fingers and call for something. It wasn't there. Unlike Disneyland, which was located near large cities, the Florida project required Disney to develop an infrastructure for the resort, roads, a water system, sewer, and so on. Quote, we had to build everything, energy plants, sewer parts, everything, Nunes said. The behind-the-scenes stuff was an enormous cost. Most of the site development headaches were handled by General Joe Potter. Most of the construction headaches were handled by Admiral Joe Fowler, who oversaw construction at Disneyland, and also by Johnny Allen, whose firm J.B. Allen & Company had overseen many Disney projects in Anaheim and who was then the prime contractor for the Florida resort. Nunes himself would develop a team of managers and supervisors ready to occupy Florida in the months leading up to its opening. Quote, we started hiring more supervisor trainees and manager trainees at Disneyland to train them, getting them ready for Florida, recalled Disney manager Jim Cora. These efforts began toward the end of the 1969 summer season. Though oddly, the company didn't look much to hire from the outside, rather to promote from within. Quote, the company in those days didn't believe anybody from the outside would get how Disney worked, Cora added, unless they came up from the bottom and worked within the ranks. It was never written down, but everybody knew it. Another longtime employee recalled that cast members referred to this as the agriculture system of career advancement. The company didn't hire managers from business programs. Instead, through on-the-job training, the company started, quote, growing their own people that way. By this point, all longtime cast members knew that better opportunities for career advancement lay in Florida. Quote, most of us were asked if we wanted to go. One employee recalled, do you want to relocate? Bob Matheson, a Disney manager, made a list of operations employees who were willing to move to Florida. The effect of this plan was threefold. It ensured that longtime guest-centered employees would be supervising newly hired hourly employees in Florida. It sought to export the media-style showmanship of a Southern California company to Central Florida, and perhaps unintentionally, it guaranteed that most supervisors and managers would be under the age of 30, as most cast members willing to relocate were relatively young, many without children looking for a promotion. In Florida, Nunes saw that the first building finished was earmarked for training, a building that would help bring the Disney work culture from California to Florida. Quote, we said, look, we've got to have a building that kind of brings some of the heritage of our company here to Florida so people will understand what they're part of, Nunes said. That building was a big success from a morale point of view. Another early building was the Walt Disney World Preview Center, where visitors could see models of the proposed resort. As buildings went vertical, Nunes found himself being pulled more toward the Florida project. Initially, company vice president Card Walker requested that Nunes relocate with a group of longtime Disneyland veterans out to Orlando, specifically to develop an operations team. But then Walker changed his mind, believing that it would be more important to keep Nunes on the West Coast close to the studio. Quote, Dick, we want you out here, Walker told him, because the planning is going to be done here. With this, Nunes' role within the company started to change from team building to universal management. By the end of 1969, the first of the Disney operations team, Bill Holscher, moved to Florida to staff the preview center. Quote, "As far as our company was concerned, we were going into a foreign culture," Jim Core recalled. "It turns out it was foreign to us, especially to the Californians, many of whom had never been east of the Mississippi River." The California cast members started to arrive as construction teams worked to create Main Street, Frontierland, and other areas of the park. But what Nunes didn't yet understand was that construction efforts weren't going as well as the company had hoped. Quote, "For 3 or 4 years, we had the largest private construction job in the whole United States. And sometimes there was an incredible disarray," recalled Sandy Quinn, one of the first marketing people hired by Disney in Florida. "I can't tell you how many times I'd run into fairly knowledgeable people, see them look around, shake their heads, chuckle a little, and say, 'You guys ain't never gonna open on time.'" But largely these concerns were hidden from upper Disney management housed in California, who only made intermittent trips to Florida. By early 1970, within some WED circles, Nunes had a reputation as being strong-willed and insistent. One WED executive, Marvin Davis, described him as an, quote, "autocratic son of a gun." One of the chief engineers, Bill Moss, observed that, quote, "Nunes was in conflict, it seemed like, with what was going on with WED." At times, Nunes' management style, though effective, drove Roy Disney nuts. Other times, Nunes, who was openly determined, was referred to as, quote, "the temper." But also, Disney executives understood that with the Florida project behind schedule, a strong-willed and fiery manager might help finish the project by its scheduled opening date. By this point, most company managers knew that the construction efforts led by the J.B. Allen Company weren't moving along as expected. Though Johnny Allen had worked with Disney for many years, he was older now and was handing responsibility off to younger managers. The reports trickled in slowly, with pieces of the overall puzzle coming in from different divisions. There was one group of J.B. Allen supervisors who flew from Florida to California to get a first-hand look at Disneyland, in which the Allen men simply stayed in their hotel rooms asking for booze and women. In Florida, there was a growing list of J.B. Allen projects that had missed their deadlines. And lastly, there were Disney employees who fed information over to the executive team in Burbank that suggested that the Allen team might not be up to the challenge. Among these individuals was Pete Markham, a civil engineer Disney had hired to identify likely building pads for the park and hotels. Initially, Markham had moved drilling rigs around the property to better understand issues with groundwater and soil composition. But in more recent months, Markham had watched efforts to build the resort slow down as the Allen team encountered problem after problem in working with the swampy terrain. More concerning, Markham thought that the Allen Company was spending money, and a lot of it, needlessly. At one of the monthly planning meetings, either at the end of September or the beginning of October 1970, Roy Disney asked if anyone had concerns that needed to be addressed. Pete Markham looked from Roy Disney to Johnny Allen, who sat beside him, and despite this, he raised his hand. When called on, Markham said that the Allen Company, quote, "was not doing a good job of spending Disney's money," and that he doubted whether the Allen Company would meet the October 1st, 1971 deadline. An uncomfortable silence came down around those at the meeting, as eyes moved from Pete Markham to Johnny Allen, the man who had just been accused of poor corporate behavior. The moment must have been uncomfortable for many in the room, as long-standing connections existed between the Disney team and the Allen team. Joe Fowler no doubt felt a particular discomfort, as in recent years he had thrown in with Allen on an outside business, a mobile home park they co-developed in California. But the lines now between Disney and Allen had been publicly drawn. As tension in the room expanded, Allen stood and leveled Markham with his dark eyes. Then he let loose, cursing him out in front of everyone. Quote, "He called me every name you could think of," Markham recalled. As the meeting ended and most left the room, Roy's team came over to thank Markham for his honesty in helping to confront troubles that they had suspected for months. Quote, "Great job, Pete," one of them said. "That's what we like to see, someone who's willing to stand up with their beliefs." But Markham also felt that because of his honesty, Allen would likely find a way to remove him from this project, as that was how things generally worked in construction. Following this, Roy Disney scheduled a meeting with Allen executives and construction managers to ascertain if their efforts would produce a finished resort by the opening day. Roy confided in one of the up-and-coming Disney managers, Carl Bongiorno, that he feared he had made a terrible decision in returning to J.B. Allen, and that even though he had traveled to Florida nearly every month, he hadn't supervised construction close enough. Roy knew that his brother Walt, had he lived, would have watched the construction team like a hawk. Quote, "I'm very concerned about the construction management company that we have down there," Roy told Bongiorno. "I want to get to the bottom of this. If we aren't going to open this theme park on October 1st, 1971, we are going to bankrupt this company. We have got commitments to participants, bankers, and stockholders. I'm concerned that things aren't going too well." The meeting with the Allen team was held in a double-wide construction trailer at the Florida site with about 50 people in attendance. On the Disney side were Roy, Don Tatum, Card Walker, Dick Nunes, Joe Fowler, and a few others. On the other side were a thick line of executives and construction managers from Allen. Over the next 2 hours, the Allen team gave a presentation on the state of construction, along with the problems they had experienced. At the end of it, Roy folded his hands together and said, "That was very good. Thank you very much for a very detailed analysis and briefing. I appreciate it very much. I have just one question, and I want a truthful answer. Will this project open on October 1st, 1971? As Roy looked around the room, he saw most of the Allen team begin to shake their heads, shifting them slightly from side to side, indicating no. Roy, starting to grow angry, told the men, quote, "If you have an objective, you accomplish it." Then again he asked if the Allen team would meet the deadline. But still, most of the men in the room indicated that it was unlikely. Quote, "I was sitting a couple of seats away from Roy," Bongiorno recalled. "He turns beet red. I mean, all the blood in his body rushed to his head. He jolts up onto his feet and pounds the table. He says, 'Goddamn son of a bitch. The life of our company is at stake, and you people from J.B. Allen are telling me that you can't open this project after a 2-hour presentation on October 1st, 1971. I can't believe this.'" According to Bongiorno, quote, "He went on a tirade for a minute or two. Then he stormed out of the trailer and slammed the door. I thought it was going to come off of its hinges." That night, the Disney team drove back to the 5 cottages they owned at Bay Hill. Roy had his own cottage, the last one on the street, nestled back among the trees and bushes. Joe Fowler had a cottage, as did Johnny Allen. They were lined up as neighbors, though now whatever professional closeness had once existed between Fowler and Allen was gone, as Fowler threw his lot in with Disney and therefore against Allen. Quote, "About 2 hours after the meeting, I got a call from Card," Bongiorno recalled. "He said, 'Carl, I'm glad I caught you. Why don't you come over? Don and I want to talk to you.' So I went over to his cottage. He started by saying that Roy was extremely upset and had made the decision to kick J.B. Allen off the project. We were going to run it ourselves." Bongiorno understood the awkwardness of this situation. Not only had Roy and Fowler agreed to remove Johnny Allen from the construction project, these conversations had taken place a stone's throw from the cottage where Allen lived while he was in Florida. After explaining the decision, Roy laid out the specifics. Despite his age, Joe Fowler would technically oversee the project with Bongiorno assisting. One of the Disney lawyers in Florida, Paul Smith, would negotiate the departure of J.B. Allen, but they still needed someone to act as the general contractor, someone who had the correct licenses and also a commitment to the Disney company. After Roy and the executives returned to California, Fowler called Pete Markham, one of the whistleblowers who had been truthful with Disney about the state of affairs on the site. Quote, "Admiral Fowler asked me if I had my professional engineer's license in Florida," Markham recalled, "and I replied, yes, sir. He then asked me if I had my general contractor's license in Florida, and I replied again, yes, sir. Then he said, I thought so. We have just fired J.B. Allen, and we've formed the Buena Vista Construction Company, and you're it." In the weeks that followed, even though Pete Markham had never before worked as a prime contractor, his title would change from engineer to chief project manager. Negotiations for Allen's removal lasted about a month, with most of the Allen managers returning to California for good. On Friday, October 23rd, all of the construction workers who once reported to J.B. Allen received a memo with their weekly paychecks marked, quote, "Organizational change," to inform them that later that day, at 3:30 p.m. precisely, they, quote, "will be employed by the Disney organization, which replaces Allen Contracting Company, Incorporated." When they returned Monday morning, these construction workers would all be Disney employees, meaning that the largest current construction project in the world was now formally overseen by a family entertainment company. Quote, "We are happy to welcome you to the Disney family," the letter concluded, "and look forward to working together with you." Nearly a month later, at the end of November, the story finally hit the papers, when a Disney spokesperson confirmed the changeover and explained that it was now complete. The reporter denied, quote, that the action was taken as a result of problems with its prime contractor, i.e. J.B. Allen, and also said that, quote, the transition was harmonious and compatible, though people involved in the disagreement remembered that the opposite was more often true. The problems with Allen had one other consequence. Joe Fowler, now 77 years old and with a house in Newport Beach, California, would need to spend more time in Florida. Quote, "At first, work in Florida was 20% of my time," Fowler explained. "Then it was 60%. The message from Roy was clear. There could be no further problems, even though most everyone sensed that large problems lay on the horizon. The Disney company would also need a larger managerial presence in Florida to ensure that the project moved forward with minimal problems. And with this, company executives began to consider Dick Nunes for a larger role in the Florida project. I'll be back next Sunday to continue our story about the grand opening of Walt Disney World. But if you're interested in the history of the Florida resort, you can also find the story of Bob Foster, who oversaw the purchase of the Disney parcel, and Joe Potter, who oversaw efforts to prepare the land and create the resort. You'll need to look back through the Bandcamp episodes about a year and a half to a 3-part series called The Water, The Wavemaker, and The Secret Hotel. In past episodes, you can also find a 2-part series called The Road to Florida that tells the story of how the Disney organization tried to keep its Florida plans secret and how eventually they were uncovered by the press. As you probably know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Among other things, we produce detail-rich, research-focused stories about the history of the Walt Disney Company. If you enjoyed these podcasts, if you find them a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the main reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. I'll be back next week. So until then, this is Todd James Pierce.